Hello everybody. Welcome back. It's raining. It's a gloomy day. Just because it's gloomy outside doesn't mean it can't be sunny in here, because we're talking back saws today. So typical business here. First of all, anybody who's already in the chat room, give me a thumbs up. Let me know my audio is good. No problems. Looks good on my end, but you never know. Again, I anticipate quite a few questions. Anytime I talk saws, people have lots to ask. So by all means, ask away. Please, if you can, put your questions in all caps in the chat room. It makes them so much easier for me to see them. Otherwise, I tend to miss them because there's a fair amount of conversation going on in there. So yeah, feel free to start firing away. I've got just a kind of an introductory. I'm going to walk through my nest of back saws, at least the nest of back saws I have here in my shop, because I now have another set that I keep at my in-laws' place up in Maine, because yeah, I have that much of a saw problem. I've also had quite a few saws over the years that I have gotten rid of, and I'm going to kind of go into detail on the saws that I have replaced, saws that I've upgraded, etc., and why. We're going to talk a little bit about getting started in the back saw arena, a couple of different options, both the antique vintage route all the way into modern manufacturers. Lots to talk about, and then of course, hopefully, a fair amount of time to address your questions as well. So I think I can get started. So a little bit of definition here. First and foremost, back saws. Pretty self-explanatory. If it's got a back on it, a spine, it is a back saw. These are your more precision saws. These are used for joinery. They're used for precisely sizing a board. So they can be used for through cuts, but obviously the through cut is limited by the depth of under the spine. So we have certainly the same elements that we had in hand saws we talked about last week. You've got pitch, the number of teeth per inch. You've got rake, the angle, the front of the tooth is lean back. You've got fleam, the angle that goes across the tooth. And with hand saws, well, with hand saws and with back saws, there is another element called hang. And hang, I think, is even more important in back saws than it is in hand saws. I didn't really talk about it with hand saws because it's kind of always going to be about the same. Hang doesn't get talked about a lot because really a lot of people will make a very generic hang. Let me first just say the hang angle is the angle if you grab the saw, kind of the angle between your hand as it naturally grabs the handle, or this angle back here. As my palm meets the handle on this line, the angle generated between that plane and the tooth line. So if straight up and down, if I'm placing the handle of the saw kind of running vertically, you can see the angle generated on the teeth here is my hang angle. From here up to there, that's the hang angle. A lot of saw makers will make a very vanilla, generic, kind of middle of the road hang angle that's going to suit the widest number of sawyers from different sizes, different tasks, etc. As you change that hang angle, you will change the saw to be more specific to certain tasks. It can also be changed based upon your stature. Now, the stature is a secondary or tertiary thing. I don't want people getting too caught up into, I'm only 5 feet tall, I need a different hang angle from Shannon who's 6'4". Technically, maybe, but probably not. That needs, you've got to have massive changes. You know, and a 16-inch change is probably not big enough to really necessitate dramatically changing your hang angle. What really matters is how you are using that saw. Are you cutting dados where you've got the saw plate very much parallel to the surface of the wood? Or are you cutting half-blind dovetails where you're really coming at it with an angle on it because you don't want to go past your baseline on the end grain, you don't want to go past your baseline along the face. So you really go at it at a steep angle. I picked those two saws because this Bearcat saw, this tiny little dovetail saw, has a really high hang angle, and it is phenomenal for sawing half-blind dovetails. I mean, look at the saw is, again, the handle's running vertical, but look at how steep that angle is. It's perfect for coming right up to a board and sawing like that in order to cut my half-blind dovetail sockets. Fantastic saw for that. Whereas this saw, this is a Bont's carcass saw, has a much lower hang angle, and you can see as I bring it to the board, as I set the plate on the board, my handle, granted I would be sawing down lower, as I bring if I put it down at a height where I'd normally saw, you can see my wrist angle, my arm and everything is at a very natural angle to be sawing like that. If I come in here and I try to do the same thing with this saw and lower it down, you can see how my wrist has to flex down like that in order to make that work. That is not as efficient. Also, the hang angle is going to adjust kind of the sweet spot of the presentation angle. So I'm presenting this saw, we'll just call it 0 degrees or parallel to the work. Now I'm presenting it 45 degrees. The presentation angle determines kind of where the best transfer of force, the best transfer of thrust on that saw is going to be and how it's going to cut most efficiently. So if I try to cut this higher angle saw down like that, it's going to stutter a little bit. It's going to feel a little bit harder to start. It's going to probably jam on me a little bit. A lot of it is because I've got bad body mechanics and I'm kind of pushing out further out to the tip, and it's going to jam up on me. This saw, because it's a much lower hang angle and the thrust pattern runs down more in line with the saw, it's very easy to start while it's working at this angle. Moved up like this, it'll still work okay because now I'm engaging very few teeth, but you can see how my wrist has to kink up to change that angle. That's hang angle. And I bring that up first because it does play a lot more role in the types of back saws we have. I don't want people to get too caught up in hang angle though, because of the fact that way madness lies. First of all, there are not a lot of saw manufacturers today that really will give you the option to adjust hang angle. We do have quite a few boutique makers now where if you were to email them and say, I want it hung at such and such an angle, they would probably do that for you. But they're also going to say, look, I normally hang my saws at this angle, and this is how they work best. To dramatically change that angle is going to mean changing a few other things. And it really can make or break a saw if you mess with it. A lot of the recipes that we follow today are tried and true for centuries and centuries. So I say that because if I skip it, somebody's going to say, what about hang angle? I have played with this a lot and looked at it in a couple different ways, and I've discovered things like this half-blind dovetail saw versus, a carcass saw, or even my Bad Axe stiletto dovetail saw. Very different hang angle, and I use them in different ways. This Bont's dovetail saw also has a very different hang angle, and again, it saws really, really well for other operations, like case sliding dovetail pins or sockets, if you will. So I'm going to kind of leave that because it gets very esoteric very fast. And I think immediately people jump on that and say, oh, I've got to play with the hang angle, or what hang angle should I get? And you're going to find a lot of saw manufacturers who are like, yeah, don't mess with that. Some of them will. And you need to really have a well-reasoned, thought-out argument as to why you want to start changing the hang angle. More importantly would be to go to a saw manufacturer, a boutique guy, like Bad Axe or Bont's or Florup Toolworks or Bearcat, and say, this is what I want this saw for. I want a saw that's going to be used for half-blind dovetails. I want a saw that's going to be used for making long dados, this guy, carcass dado sides. I want a saw that's going to be used for making window sash, aka a sash saw. The recipes built into those descriptions, dovetail saw, tenon saw, sash saw, etc., those have a set of hang angle or hang angles that kind of go with them. And that's really where you stick. So there's kind of my initial disclaimer there. Our Japanese saws back saws. The ones with a spine on them are back saws. But it's kind of it's a different thing there. The Dozuki has a spine on it, and it is used very much like a back saw. Pay no attention to what I just said about hang angle. The Ryoba does not have a back on it. It's not a back saw. It would be more classified as a hand saw, I suppose. But Japanese saws tend to be their own, march to the beat of their own drum there. Good question. Bob says, do you find it helpful to stick with one maker in back saws? Absolutely not. There are A lot of different ones. I have represented on my bench right now 3 different saw makers. Well, technically 4, myself being one because I've got a shop-made saw down there. I have used Veritas saws, I've used Lee Nielsen saws, I've used Spears & Jackson vintage saws, I've used Atkins saws, Diston saws, Bonts, Bad Axe, Bearcat. I have not used any Florup saws. I don't know if he's in the chat room, but I hear good things, very good things. I've used Lynx back saws. I've used several different Japanese back saws, whatever the, what's the common maker? Is it Bakuma? I don't know. The cheap guys that you can pick up at like Woodcraft and stuff. I've used a bunch of different manufacturers. They all kind of follow the same recipes, if you will. To me, choosing a back saw, really, you need to have an idea of what you want to do with it first. That dictates everything else from there. The manufacturer will have subtle differences along the way. A lot of them, especially once you get into the boutique guys, there's a lot of thought going into the shaping of the handle, which is incredibly important. That handle should fit like a glove. It should be very well balanced. It should allow you to essentially take your hands, let's see if I can do this, take your hands kind of off the saw and it will balance on your hand. I mean, I've got a little bit holding right there. I could probably take that finger out and it would balance. I'm just too nervous to do that because I love the saw, but it fits my hand really well. It's very well balanced. It's very well hung. When you move into more mass-produced saws, and this was very common with Diston saws, they are made to fit a wider audience. Today's version of Diston, believe it or not, is Lee Nielsen. Lee Nielsen is a mass producer of hand tools. Now, they may still produce in smaller quantities than Diston did in his heyday, but today's standards, when you look at manufacturers currently in business, Lee Nielsen, maybe Veritas, are probably the largest makers of saws. They produce more saws than anybody else in the back saw realm. There may be some, you know, the Lynx and Garlic and things like that. I don't know how many saws they're making, but on the upper echelon of things, Lee Nielsen is distant. What's interesting now is Lee Nielsen is kind of a middle-of-the-road saw maker. Still outstanding saws. I used a Lee Nielsen carcass saw and dovetail saw and tenon saw for almost 10 years before I upgraded to Bad Axe. Couple of reasons there, but one of the big things was the fit of the handle on a Lee Nielsen saw is a little bit more generic than the fit of the handle on a Bad Axe saw or a Bonds saw. Because when you order a Bad Axe saw or a Bonds saw, you're actually giving specific hand dimensions to the maker, and they are sizing the handle from there. You can't choose a handle size from Lee Nielsen or from Veritas. They have one size fits all. And it does, truly, one size does fit all, but it doesn't have that quite fit like a glove thing. Some of you may be lucky and have just the perfectly average hand size, and it does fit you like a glove. Others, like me, have big hands, and I found that a lot of Lee Nielsen saws were a little bit constricting. Veritas saws are incredibly constricting to me. Their handles are weird, but Veritas has gone another direction and added some innovation to the saw market, changed a few things up. I'll get to that in a little bit. I love Veritas. I don't love their saws. I think they gerrymandered the pudding a little too much there. Somebody remind me to get back to that. So I wouldn't say stick with one saw maker over another for any particular reason. There are a lot of great saw makers out there right now. What I look for, and one of the reasons that I have gravitated towards Bad Axe a lot over the years, let's be real, Mark was really one of the first boutique makers to come on the scene. This Tenon saw, I think, is the 6th saw that Mark Harrell ever made under the Bad Axe logo. Actually, he was still known as Techno Primitives when I bought this. This was the launch of Bad Axe, this 18-inch Tenon saw, as this 16-inch carcass saw. It's more of a Sash saw, but it's a carcass saw. So these guys were kind of on the scene first, but they have kind of continued to refine things. This handle, as it exists in this model, if you were to go and buy this saw now, you'll find that the handle actually fits even better. Mark has made not so much changes, but he's added more sizing into his manufacturer. But this Tenon saw, it happens to fit me quite well. So they were really the first one on the boutique scene, which is why I kind of started gravitating towards them. I have introduced additional saws. This Bonce saw is so incredibly well balanced. It just floats in my hand. I mean, I barely gripping this thing and it just hangs out there. This is much more of a glove-like fit than the Bad Axe one. But one of the things that I do like about Bad Axe, and I state this all the time, is they are, if they're not the only, they're certainly one of the only makers in the market that use folded backs. This plate is not glued into place. It is not fixed in place. This spine is folded over it and it holds the saw plate in tension. It's an incredibly important aspect because if you're using a back saw and you do tweak the saw somehow, the plate will actually slip under the back. And if you hold up the saw, this is actually just a good rule of thumb if you have a folded back saw. If you hold up the saw, you'll see kind of a wavy S pattern in the saw. You have not ruined the saw has just come out of tension under the back. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. I happen to find this one works really well. Grab the saw plate, the plate itself, not the spine, up by the toe and just tap it. Light little tap on the spine. I use a rubber mallet for that. And all that's doing is allowing the spine to drop down and pull the saw plate into tension. This wasn't out of tension, but you'll find that just a light tap and that little, kind of wavy S curve is now gone and you have a straight line. I liken this to ski bindings. Ski bindings are designed to pop off your foot before it rips off your foot. But if you tighten up that ski binding, the release on that too much, you will tear your ACL or tear off your leg because the torque from that long ski on your tiny little knee is massive. So they are designed to disengage the ski when the torque becomes too high. Same thing happens with a saw. If you torque the plate too much, it will slip under the spine and it becomes loose and it won't damage or irreparably kink the saw plate. Then it's just a matter of tapping it back into tension. Mark has more formal instructions on how to retension a spine at that point. So, Eric, are you in the chat room? Because I think you have folded saw. Floor Up Toolworks, I think, has folded saw plates. The other saw plates are grooved and glued in place, or sometimes not glued, held under some tension. This is a Bonce saw. It has a groove that's actually cut into the solid brass spine. This spine is not folded over this in like a U shape and pressing in on it. It has a groove cut and the saw is fit into that groove. Brian, are you in there? Bearcat? This is folded. Good for you. So this is a Bearcat saw. It is a folded plate. If you look real close there, you can see that is one solid flat piece that's been folded around and the whole thing is held in tension. I frankly believe, and this is how vintage saws were made. If you look at old Distons, old Atkins, Spears and Jackson, things like that, they have folded backs. And I really think that is a key point, especially as you're starting out in sawing, because that will save you from destroying a saw plate. And I do it. We all do it. The longer the saw is, the greater the chance of you doing some boneheaded body mechanic thing and tweaking the saw and causing it to go out of tension. It's just a nice fail-safe. So that's when I go shopping for saws, that's one of the things that I look for is, does it have a folded back? If it doesn't, I want to kind of compensate for that. This doesn't have a folded back, but it's really hard to put so much torque on a tiny little dovetail saw that you're going to cause problems. That's the true irony, is this saw that Brian sent me is so short. I don't know that I could ever tweak it because it's so short, but it does have a folded back, so I'm safe in that respect. So that's definitely one of the things that I have gravitated towards over time, and that's probably why I tend to fall on Bad Axe. The other thing is some of the other manufacturers have come onto the scene since Bad Axe, and I just don't need any more saws. I've got multiple tenon saws and multiple dovetail saws. I have more dovetail saws than I actually need right now, which is kind of an issue because people have sent me dovetail saws. It's a tough problem to have. Don't get me wrong. I'm not complaining, but I'm not shopping for saws, so I kind of haven't sampled the waters as much. But it's fantastic if you are shopping for saws because there's just an incredible variety of people out there making them now. So in looking at kind of my little nest of saws here, I want to start with the bigger guys and go from there. Let me just double check the chat room real quick. Eddie G says, sawing dovetails in 1/2-inch hard maple takes about 30 strokes to go a 1/2 inch. Should I expect better performance from a Veritas 14 TPI dovetail saw? Absolutely. That is really slow. At 14 points per inch, that is incredibly slow, especially in 1/2-inch hard maple. Sounds to me like the saw is really dull. I don't count my saw strokes, but I guarantee you most of the time to cut dovetails, it's less than 4, maybe 5 or 6. But yeah, that's something screwy there. That sounds really dull. Handle ergonomics, oval cross section or flat sides. That is a personal question, I think. I like a little bit of a flat on the sides of my saws. And I think the more rounded it is, the less that saw will kind of register in your hand. But here's a good example. This Tenon saw has, it does have a flat on the side, but it's a very soft flat. You really, if you pull this under raking light, you really can't see any kind of hard line coming out of it. But there's still a flat there, and it fits my hand really, really nicely. This saw, this is a bond saw, has, you can see a hard line here. There is a definite flat and there is an arris there. But this registers in my hand very, very cleanly. Now there is also a thickness difference between these two saws, probably about 1/8 of an inch. This is about 1/8 of an inch thicker than the Bad Axe one. So it fills out my hand a little bit more, and that definite flat kind of registers nicely against the flats of my palm. So, I mean, it's a very small issue. I don't think you're gonna find it being a make or break thing, whether or not there's a flat or full oval, but that's one of the beauties of being able to make your own shop-made saw. This is a dado saw that I made, and I have tweaked this to fit my hand absolutely perfectly. And I discovered as I started rounding it, there are definite flats in here. This fits me a lot better, but I discovered that I rounded it more on this side than I did on this side because it fit my left hand a lot better. If I hold this with my right hand, it still fits, but it doesn't fit quite as well because of how much flat I've put on one side of the saw on the other. So in this case, this saw is actually handed, and it's two-handed as well with thumb grips out here. This is, you know, one of the beauties of being able to make your own saw like that. There is a place for my index finger here, whereas there is not a place for my index finger holding it with my right hand. There is a hard line there, and there is a nice rounded area there. So it's so personal. If you start rounding surfaces, you really should be doing that in order to fit your hand. What you'll find is if you're buying a vintage saw, you'll find that those surfaces are already rounded from years and years and years of work. And then, first of all, you know it's a great saw because some craftsmen used that thing to death, which means it performed. If you find a vintage saw that is brand new, there might be something wrong with it because it didn't work and somebody put it on a shelf and never bothered to use it. You know, there are instances where it goes in a tool cabinet and, you know, maybe the person died and it stayed in the tool cabinet and never got used. But saws that are in great shape are saws that haven't been used. And for a working craftsman, that's probably not a good sign. So move these guys out of the way. This is a miter box saw. It's its own animal, if you will. It has very little hang. It's designed to work. I mean, a miter box, you think about it, it fixes the saw in a track running parallel to the wood. So you want that thrust pattern to be as in line with the tooth line. And that's what a miter box saw does. It really angles that down. And then big saw, but fine pitch because it's meant to make a finer cut. Whereas you get another big saw, that's a 20-inch saw. This is an 18-inch saw. This is a Tenon saw. This is probably my most used saw in the shop. When you're building furniture, at least when I'm building furniture, 90% of the joinery is mortise and tenon. This is the guy that does the work. It's a big saw. Most importantly, it is 4.5 inches under the back. 18-inch long plate. I can cut really deep bridle joints with this. And most of the tenon joinery I do for furniture is 2 inches or shorter. Bridle joints, things can get to 3.5, sometimes even 4 inches long. I've got the depth under the back to be able to make that in one cut. It's incredibly useful. The saw plate, now I can't remember how it's pitched. Probably 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, 10 points per inch. Pretty typical for a tenon saw. Aggressive cut. It's like next to no rake. There's a couple of degrees of rake because it's mostly meant for hardwood work. This is an aggressive saw. This is a saw that is designed to cut tenons and only tenons. There are no compromises made here with hybrid filing or any of that mumbo jumbo. This is a rip cut saw. It cuts really fast and it cuts really accurately. There's practically no set on this thing. Love this saw if you can't tell. Absolutely love it. It transformed my understanding of tenons. I was using a vintage tenon saw that really wasn't set up real well. It was my own fault for not really paying attention to that. I used this guy and suddenly all of my tenons were like spot on, splitting the line perfect because this saw is set to perform. I have since retuned that old tenon saw, and that lives at my in-laws' house in Maine, and it cuts great now. This is a big saw, there's no doubt. It can take some getting used to using. It requires a really good handle and a good feel for the handle in order to unweight the toe to get it to start. But boy, once that thing starts cutting, it is an absolute beast. This guy is more of the typical tenon saw you're gonna find. 16, about a 15-inch plate. And again, more than likely 10 points per inch. A little less depth under the back. The handle fits like a glove. It's incredible. These saws are kind of middle of the road as far as hang. They're not hung up super, super high because a lot of times when you're sawing a tenon, you're not sawing it right on the edge of the board like you would approach a dovetail. So with a dovetail, I'm going to hold the saw and come at it kind of 90 degrees-ish or turn down like that. So you want that higher angle when you're turning the saw down at an angle. With a tenon, you generally are angling it away from you and sawing this way. So with the board angled away, now I actually need a lower hang angle to cut that tenon. And the reason that we angle the boards away is so that we can actually see the line across the top and the line along the edge. And I instruct my students to break the tenon into multiple cuts. Cut across the end grain shallowly, cut down the face shallowly, and then connect the hypotenuse. So you've cut across to this point, you cut down to your baseline here. Once you've gotten on the line shallowly, then it's a matter of connecting that hypotenuse of the triangle all the way through, flip the board, repeat, and you've got a perfect tenon. But in order to do that, I've got to angle it so that I can see both lines and cut one line and another line. You could try to cut both lines at once. You can get there as you get more experience with a tenon saw, but really it makes more sense to focus on one line at a time. But because of that angle, the hang of the tenon saw is actually more akin to something you would find in like a carcass saw because it's not really designed for cutting up at a strong angle like that. This is a fantastic saw for most of your furniture tenons that are going to be 2 inches and under. I find that it just cuts a little bit less aggressively simply because it's a smaller plate. I also find that the greater depth under the back gives me better control over the verticality of the cut. I know this has been talked about a fair bit. Christopher Schwarz has talked about this on his blog in the past, but the whole idea of the depth under plate being a big deal is need a longer example. Well, we'll just go with that. If I try to balance a pencil on my finger, it's very difficult to do. Short pencil, very difficult to balance it on my finger. This hammer, which is about twice as long, is a little bit easier. Still not easy to balance, but I can balance it on my finger because I've got that longer lever. If I take a broom, the broom is actually really easy to balance on your hand because it's so much longer. Same idea happens with a taller back. That is so much easier to balance when it's taller, and I actually find that the weight on the spine being high over the work telegraphs any slight deviation from plumb a lot more noticeably than a shorter saw plate. And you'll notice dovetails, they have shorter saw plates, first of all, because we tend to make a lot shorter depth of cut with dovetails, but you don't need that depth under back. That's going to actually sacrifice a little bit of precision by having that lesser depth under the back. So when it comes to tenons, depth of cut is kind of important. So tenon saws are much deeper saw plates, and that's why I find I've got a lot more success with those bigger saws. Frankly, I think tenon saws are probably the most important saw in the shop, just because we cut tenons so much in furniture making. Depends on what you're building, obviously. If you're building, if you're a box maker, tenon saw is not going to be that important. Probably zero importance, because you're probably using very little tenons in your work. However, you may be cutting a lot of wider box miters, and having a depth of cut under the plate is really important. This is where this saw comes into play. This is a crosscut saw. It is 16 inches long. It's got 4 inches depth of cut under the back. This is a great saw if I've got to do precision through cuts, because I've got plenty of depth here. It's also a fantastic saw for carcass joinery. If I've got to cut, what's the word? Breadboards, geez. Breadboard ends, where I've got to make a really long, nicely vertical cross cut for the tenon on a breadboard. I like the high depth of the back, because again, it telegraphs any slight deviation from vertical. I've got lots of saw plate and a coarser pitch, so it's going to cut a little bit more aggressively. But again, because it's cross cut, it's filed fleam, it's going to cut cleaner across the grain. This is just kind of the more aggressive version of a carcass saw. One could actually, I guess, call it a sash saw because it's 16 inches long, but even then it's a bit too long for a sash saw. This is just a really good, heavy duty, large case dado type saw. If you're doing 24-inch deep cases, this is fantastic for cutting those dados. I'm going to skip this guy and go to this guy. This is your very typical carcass saw. It's 12 inches long, 12 points per inch, I think. I got a better count so that I'm sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yes. 12 points per inch. And I've done a video on this before. I think this is probably the first saw anyone should buy. When you are looking for, well, I guess you can make a case for buying, a hand saw, like a crosscut hand saw for breaking down lumber. But once you start getting into back saws, this is the first saw you should buy. It is the jack plane of saws. It is, by definition, a carcass saw is filed crosscut. So I don't care what Lee Valley says, you can buy a rip filed carcass saw. It's not a carcass saw if it's filed rip. It's a tenon saw if it's filed rip. A carcass saw, by definition, is used for making carcass cuts, cutting carcasses to length, cutting carcass joinery, aka dados. Those are crosscut actions. The saw is filed crosscut. It's got a more relaxed rake, not only because it makes it easier to start, makes it cut through a cross grain situation a little bit easier, but the more teeth you try to engage in the wood at the same time, if I'm cutting a dado, I'm cutting it parallel to the surface of the wood, I'm engaging a lot of teeth. So you don't want 0 degrees of rake. That sucker is going to jump and vibrate all over the place. Relax that rake and allow it to skate over the wood a little bit more. This is, I don't recall the rake on this. This is a Bont saw. This is straight out of his catalog, if you will. There's been no customizations done here. Same thing with the fleam. It's designed to cut well, cleanly, smoothly across the grain. This, like the tenon saw, is purpose designed for cross-cutting work. Does that mean I can't do a rip cut with it? Does it mean I'll be struck by lightning if I try to cut a dovetail with it? Absolutely not. The 12-inch length, the narrower under the back, probably what, 2.5? 2 5/8, but this is a canted plate, so it's a little 2.5 at the front and 2 3/4 at the back. So it's what we call a canted saw plate, where there's less under the toe than there is under the heel. Don't get me started on canted saw plates. Let's just say I don't really think they're that big of a deal. The smaller size of this is a lot easier to control if you're getting into sawing this can be intimidating. So this will work really well for cutting tenons. It's slower than cutting tenons with my 18-inch tenon saw or even my 16-inch crosscut saw, rightfully so. But when you're first getting started, you probably want to slow down. You don't want to, you want to be really careful you're sticking to your lines. You don't want to just blow through that. That'll come with skill. This guy is used constantly in my shop. It actually lives in my joinery bench because I actually use it more for like really delicate work where I want to be up higher. Anytime I'm dovetailing, the little cross cuts that I've got to make to cut out the half pins, this is what this gets used for. All kinds of little tasks. This is just a fantastic saw. It can be used for just about everything. I had a Lee Nielsen carcass saw for many, many years. Like I said, I ended up upgrading when the, well, let's be honest, Ron sent me this saw and it was so head and shoulders better than the Lee Nielsen, just from the fit and finish. It's not that Lee Nielsen is bad. This is just a little bit finer points to it. The handle is a much better fit. Everything just, yeah. It's just, I mean, it's what happens when you go from a mass-produced to a boutique saw. It was just a better, better all-around saw. So I ended up giving my carcass saw away to a student. But I was doing a lot of work suddenly that was requiring me to gang pieces together. I was building a lot of frame and panel work where I was wanting to gang together all of my tenons to get the most accurate shoulder-to-shoulder dimension. I wanted a longer saw that was going to do that work. And this is really the hunting ground, if you will, of the Sash saw. Most Sash makers, in order to create accuracy, and a lot of vintage Sash are square. The windows were square because it was easiest to cut all four tenons, all four corners at once. You had four pieces that were all exactly the same length. You ganged them all together. You grabbed a saw. You cut all four shoulders at once. You went to the other end of the board. You cut all four shoulders at once. And that way you ensured that you had a square construction because that shoulder to shoulder dimension was now exactly the same on all four pieces. That's how you ensure quality Sash joinery. The Sash saw is at about 14 inches long, and it's perfect for taking 1.5 to 2, maybe 2.5 inch wide Sash pieces, all four of them, ganging together, making that cut, and still having enough saw plate to excavate the sawdust. And that's really why this was called the Sash saw. That's what it was used for. That's what I needed. I needed something that was a little bit longer. It has the same pitch, but it's also got more depth under the back. I find this to be perfect for ganging parts together. Anytime I'm building a table, I will take my two apron pieces. Well, if it's a rectangular table, I'll take the two end apron pieces, the two side apron pieces. I will gang those two pieces together, cut them all at once. That ensures the shoulder to shoulder dimension is identical from one piece to the other. Or if I'm doing dado joinery in the side of a case, like a typical bookcase, 12 to 15 inches deep, this is perfect for that. Absolutely perfect for it. This has become probably the most used saw in my arsenal right now. It gets used just about every project, and because of that, it actually has a special place in my tool cabinet right there, because I use it at the bench all the time. Where this carcass saw may live where the camera is, behind the camera on my joinery bench, because I use most of the joinery bench. Most of the back saw work that I do in day-to-day involves that Sash saw, and I wanted to just be able to turn around, grab it, and go right to work, which is why it's the only saw that actually lives in this case. All my other back saws are scattered throughout the shop where they get used more often than not. So this was an example where I had, like last week, where I had specific needs that needed to be met, and this necessitated another saw. This handle is teak. I was provided by me to Mark, because I happen to work with probably the largest importer of teak in the country. So I had some teak floating around. Great saw. The Sash saw, I think, has become a lot more popular lately. We're seeing saws getting longer. Dovetail saws, it's very common to find 12-inch dovetail saws. It's also very common to find 14-inch carcass saws, which technically is a Sash saw. But Bad X has a saw they call the bayonet, which is really, it's a Sash saw. The problem I have with the bayonet is it's too shallow under the back. This is not a bayonet. This is a custom saw. I think actually he now has something called a Sash saw, which probably has the same geometry as this. When I bought this at the time, that wasn't an offering, so this was a custom. The bayonet is less depth under the back, and it starts to lose some of its function, I think. I like more depth under the back for that vertical feel than the bayonet gives me, which is why I don't have one. I had one and I I raffled it off as a deal I did with Mark over at Bad Axe. And I haven't since sought to replace it for my own because this saw does everything that bayonet does and more, actually. Sorry, Mark. You know how I feel about the bayonet. I've told you that. Which brings me to dovetail saws. Oh, I knew it was coming. Somebody had to ask my opinion on hybrid filings. I'll get to that. I'll get to that. Hand tool school students are rolling their eyes right now and preparing, getting out the popcorn, getting ready for some fun. Dovetail saws are, it's where most people enter. You know, your average power tool woodworker, your average new woodworker, they get into hand tools because they want to hand cut dovetails. Hand cut dovetails is like, it's the entry point. Everybody wants to hand cut dovetails. It's really ironic, I think, because dovetails make up a very small amount of typical furniture work, but regardless, dovetails are probably the most precise, maybe, that's open to debate, probably the most precise fiddly joint that we're going to create, and they require a finer pitch saw. This is something that I think has gotten a little out of control. There are a lot of dovetail saw makers now making 18 and 20 points per inch saws. And if you've ever tried to sharpen an 18 or 20 points per inch saw, it sucks. Like, those needle files just are terrible. So, you know, there's reasons. There are reasons for it. If you're doing a lot of box making with really thin stock, an 18 or 20 points per inch saw does make some sense. I tend to fall in the 14, 15, or 16 points per inch works the best. This is a 14 points per inch dovetail saw. It's called the Stiletto. It's a 12-inch long plate from Bad Axe. This is, I want to say it's 15 or 16 from Bonts. Brian, I don't remember. This is probably 14. Do you remember, Brian? You're in the chat room. I'm not going to hold you to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14? Did I just miscount? 14 or 15, something like that. Doesn't really matter. It's fine. It's fine enough. Doesn't need to be any finer than that. It'd be too difficult to sharpen. But this is where everybody lands. Everybody wants to have a dovetail saw first. And, you know, if cutting dovetails by hand is your goal, having a good dovetail saw is fantastic. They're going to have less set on them, but I would say marginally less set than your average carcass or tenon saw. A lot of times the plate is made from thinner material. The whole thing is designed to just create a tiny, tiny little kerf and do it with laser precision. So don't get me wrong, cutting dovetails with a tenon saw or a carcass saw can be done very easily, but having a nice dovetail saw certainly does make the whole process a lot more pleasant. I have 4 more dovetail saws that are not pictured here. I know, I've got a problem. 2 of them live in Maine. The other 2 have actually been loaned to people probably indefinitely. We'll just call them, we called them, quote, a loan, but it was helping somebody out who was getting started. For whatever reason. I've used a bunch of different dovetail saws, and this has really become my stable of saws. This is the guy that does most of the work. The longer plate allows me to just blow through dovetails. I also tend to gang my parts together. If I'm making drawers, I'll put, 4 or 5, not 5, even numbers, 4, 6, sometimes 8 drawer sides together and cut all the saws, all the dovetails at once. Having this long plate is great, and having an uncanted saw plate is great for that as well, because I know exactly where that sawtooth, that saw line is as I cut across that thickness. The canted plate leaves that a little mysterious. Yes, it will prevent from cutting past my baseline, but I don't want to do extra work when I'm ganging this stuff together. I want to know exactly where the toe is ending up on the backside of my cut. That's why I don't like canted plates. I can, when I'm sawing, I can sight down my back and I can sight the back I can sight along the back and see that relative to the top of the board. And if I'm holding that parallel, I know my tooth line is parallel. If I have a canted plate, I have to guess where that is ending up. And then you kind of angle your saw, and that ends up changing the body mechanics. Not a fan of canted saw plates. I think it's gimmick more than anything else. Saw makers in the room, you feel free to contradict me there. I'm sure that there are some people that do better with a canted plate. Gimmick / crutch, maybe? That'll piss some people off. This guy, much higher hang angle, fantastic saw for joinery like sliding dovetails on the front of a case. These sliding dovetails run only about 2 inches deep. They encapsulate just the drawer blade, but I absolutely cannot go past that line because this is a show surface here. This guy presents it at just the right angle to cut those. Also, it works really well when that case is down lower on my bench. When I put the case side up higher on my joinery bench, the angle is not quite right. This is just absolutely perfect as I stand here at my rouleau for cutting those dovetail pins. Really great for that. Does great for regular dovetails as well. This saw, Bearcat, Brian sent this to me, and this was an offer of gratitude and appreciation. Thank you again, Brian. I think I've thanked you many times before, but I had no input into this. Brian said he was going to send me something, and it just so happens the hang angle on this, as I said before, is perfect for half-blind dovetails. It's not in the shop anymore, but the side table that I just finished had 3 drawers, all half blinds in the front with very precious bird's eye maple drawer fronts. I did not want to screw that up. This was absolutely perfect. It allowed me to really get down to my baseline on the face and still not be close to my line on the front, on the actual end grain of the board, to the point where when I finished sawing, I had to actually drop the toe, consciously drop the toe down to get there. Great saw for that, very specific reason, but also the short saw plate, there's no reason to have a 12-inch long saw plate because when you think about half-blind dovetails, the cut you're making is so small. It's like 3 or 4 strokes and you're done. So this short saw plate was just perfect for that. Because it's shorter, it's like choking up on the bat. It's even more precise. It's just a really good saw for half-blind dovetails. That's where these tend to fall down, these longer plate saws. While they work fine for half-blind dovetails, this is really a through dovetail saw. It's designed to make that long stroke, cut straight through, cut with straighter accuracy by making that long stroke. This is more of a dibble saw. You want little short strokes in order to get exactly right. This would work really well for sliding dovetail pins as well. Did I have this saw? I don't think. I made a shaker pedestal table a while ago, you know, the tripod table where you have to cut sliding dovetails into the turn column. I don't think I had this saw at the time. I think I actually used that with this saw. This would have been perfect for that because I had to cut that angle and then I could have dropped the handle down and kind of work that stop cut back. This would have been perfect for that. In fact, I should go build a tripod table right now just so that I can use that saw. So that's my nest of saws. I have just the miter box saw. That's it. There's really less going on there as far as number of saws, but there's more fiddly bits that come up that make back saws, because these are all premium saws from premium makers. The handles all fit perfectly. They're all hung really well. They respond to my needs really well. If I had a lot more vintage saws, if I had all vintage saws, I would actually probably have more saws because I would find more reasons for the tweaking that wasn't there in some of those mass-produced handles. I think handle fit is of utmost importance in these saws. It really must fit well. The sloppier the fit, the more you have to grip that handle tight, and I'm sure you guys have seen this, where as I'm holding this saw relaxed, see if I can get straight onto the camera. If I'm holding this saw nice and relaxed, you can see the plate running straight up and down. As I grip that, see how the plate actually moves? It's actually changing angle on me as I grip too tightly. If your saw handle is a sloppy fit and you have to hold it tighter in order to not lose control of the saw, you are throwing the cut off plumb. So you want that looser grip, and you don't want to have to feel like you're having to hold on to the saw. It should just nestle in your hand nicely in order to get a nice clean cut, which is why that handle fit is so important. So I'll get to the hybrid one in a second just because what are my opinions on the Bad Axe 12-inch small tenon dovetail saw? I have that saw that lives in Maine. It is another kind of jack saw. It's similar to a carcass saw. When it was originally made, it was kind of designed, it was really Mark's first foray into the hybrid filing. It's actually closer to crosscut file than it is rip file. It's a good all-around size, middle of the road depth of back, good length. I want to say it's 12 inches long. It was before these guys came into being. Worked great for a lot of different things. Fantastic all-around saw, which is why I still have it. I haven't given it away to somebody or whatever. It just lives in my secondary shop up in Maine now. Great saw. Anybody that has purchased my orientation semester at the hand tool school, that was the saw that I was using through all the projects there. That back saw was the one that was used. Great saw. Hybrid filing. Hybrid filing is perfectly fine. Let's be real. There's not that much change going on. We're talking a couple of degrees of change to the rake and the fleam. It's taking an extreme cross-cut filed saw like a miter box saw and an extreme rip filed saw like a tenon saw and meeting them halfway, jumping somewhere in the middle as far as your tooth geometry. It's in the case of a hybrid filed small tenon saw. Again, it's similar to this guy, a little bit more depth under the back. It might actually be a little shorter. I can't remember the length of it now. And also mine was like brand spanking new when Mark first came out with it, so he may have changed the specs since then. That really, well, let's just put it this way. It's not so dramatic a difference that I find it to be that big of a feature. I actually prefer to be a lot more purist in the geometry of my saws. I'm fortunate where I am now with my tool set. I've got a lot of saws. I've added saws over the years. I've been able to refine and add certain saws for certain tasks. I have the luxury of being able to say I'm sawing tenons, I'm going to use a tenon saw. I have the luxury of standing at my dovetail bench and say, okay, I finished cutting the tails. Now I want to cut off that little half tail in the end, which is technically a cross cut. So I put it down and I pick up this carcass saw that's right next to it. That's a nice thing to have, right? It's nice to have that ability. If you're just getting started and you're looking for that saw to stretch a little bit further, that is really where Mark was going with the hybrid filing. This way, one saw is going to do a lot more. I find that what happens is anytime you get that jack of all trades, master of none, you lose performance on certain things. A hybrid filed saw will not cut a tenon as fast or efficiently as a tenon rip filed saw. A hybrid filed saw won't cut a wide dado as quickly, efficiently should be the better word to use, and accurately as a specific purpose-built crosscut filed sash saw. It just won't, because you're making a compromise. You're going in the middle of the road. Is that compromise something that's going to oh my God, this is terrible, I hate making compromises? Probably not. To the average person getting started, it's going to be perfect. And that's really where the hybrid filing, I think, comes into play. My problem with hybrid filing is eventually the better your sawing gets, the more you're going to demand from your saws. The more you're going to wish, I wish this tenon saw was more aggressive. I wish this tenon saw cut a little bit faster because I'm spending a lot of time cutting this super long tenon. So what happens to your hybrid filed tenon saw? You get confident enough to sharpen your own saw and you reduce the rake. You drop it back to 0 or maybe 2 degrees. You file away the fleam because you want a more aggressive saw. And that's fine. You know, that can be a natural evolution, if you will. I've gotten more confident in my sawing. I don't need this compromise in the geometry. I want a more purist, more aggressive, more efficient tenon saw. By that time, you probably will be comfortable in sharpening your own saws and you can alter that geometry yourself. So today, I would never buy a hybrid filed saw because to me, I don't want the compromise. For a lot of people getting started, that compromise can be a great thing. Just recognize that you may eventually grow out of that compromise and you may want a little bit more performance out of your tenon saw or out of your carcass saw, and you might end up refiling away that. Or you could probably send it back to Bad Axe and they would file it for you. So that's my thought. I've gotten particularly heated about it because people tend to think of it as this like silver bullet. Oh, it's hybrid filed. And even Mark will laugh at that and say, it's really not that big of a deal. There's no secret recipe or sauce here. It's a minor little adjustment. It's a relaxing of the profile in order to make it really easier to start. That's what it comes down to. Have you seen handle wood movement take a back saw out of alignment? No. Never seen that happen. I suppose it's possible. But no. I mean, he's saying it thinks it may have happened with the Lee Nielsen saw. That would be a lot of movement. But I mean, it's certainly possible. And if that's the case, I would contact Lee Nielsen because they will fix it like that. It's one of the reasons that handles are made from quarter sawn material. So the whole block itself is going to be a little bit more stable. But yeah, I guess it's possible. I would think that it would have to move a hell of a lot in order to throw the saw out of alignment, in which case the initial cut of wood probably wasn't kiln dried. Or not, it was kiln dried, but maybe not dried all the way down to 6%. I don't know. It just may be a quality control thing that if that is actually the case, I would contact Lee Nielsen and they will fix that in a heartbeat for you. What might be, whoa, chat room just moved on me. What might be some of the reasons for a dovetail saw to drift to the left when cutting dovetails? What's the expression? A poor craftsman blames his tools. I think that saws are the one exception to that rule, with a big caveat. A saw that is set improperly is always going to drift one way or another. So if you have a dovetail saw, if the dovetail saw in question is a vintage saw and you don't know anything about its provenance, who set it, maybe you set it, maybe you've never set a saw before, there's every possibility that you have got too much saw set and it's pulling one way or another. How you can correct that is actually the direction that it's pulling towards. Say it's pulling to the left. Kick one or two teeth a little bit more out to the left, and it kind of acts like an outrigger in a canoe, and it's gonna, or a rudder on a canoe, and it's gonna steer it back into line. However, a dovetail saw should have very little set to begin with. So you probably, rather than kicking teeth out to steer it back, you probably want to stone that saw and remove the set, because that may be more of the issue, is there's too much set on that dovetail saw, and it could be too much set to one side or the other that's pulling out of alignment. But before you do anything with your saw, before you start jiggering with it and stoning the sides or trying to press flat the teeth or adding more set or anything to the saw itself, let's go back to that dogma, poor craftsman blames his tools. Let's blame ourselves first. We are the squeaky wheel in this situation. We are the imperfect thing with all the bendy bits that can't be controlled and stay in alignment. What I recommend is set up a board to saw dovetails and get a friend or a tripod friend and a camera spot on in profile. So as I line up to make that cut, I want the camera dead on. And you want to film yourself making that cut, and you want to pay very close attention to your body alignment. Is the toe of the saw in line with your wrist? Is your wrist in line with your elbow? Is your elbow in line with your shoulder? And as you make the saw cut, does any of that change? What I find more often than not is, I'm exaggerating here, but this elbow hitches out. And a lot of times it hitches around the body because we tend to get in real tight. We're really focusing on a saw, and my arm is like cocked up against my side because I want to be really precise. And as I pull my arm back, it has to move out around my body. And that actually, just that action of moving out around my body is twisting the saw, and it's making it go to the left. If you're right-handed, a lot of times it'll twist the saw and go to the right. You will actually find other instances where people are standing too far away and they're bringing their saw in close to their body and it's twisting it and pulling it to the left. Look at that profile shot and pay very close attention to your hand. Is it moving back and forth like a piston? If it deviates at all, you may find that that saw continually pulls one way or another. Another way to test if it's a saw set issue, draw a bunch of vertical lines down a board, close your eyes, and just saw. Just doesn't matter how deep the saw cuts go, let it bottom out on the back. It's a dovetail saw, it's not gonna cut that far. Just don't pay attention. Make a saw cut you've got your hand on the top of the board, make a saw cut, move it over, make another saw cut, move it over. Those various lines on the board will give you frames of reference. And you can see without doing anything, without paying attention, without trying to steer the saw, what does the saw naturally do? And if it's really deviating a lot, especially on a dovetail cut, because at most I'm getting an inch deep, an inch and a half deep on this cut. Most of our dovetails are probably 3/4 of an inch deep, maybe at most an inch deep for typical case joinery, right? So if you're getting significant deviation over the course of an inch, you've got a noticeable body mechanic issue that will show up on film, or you've got a noticeable saw set issue that could probably be fixed just by stoning and removing the saw. Long-winded answer to what should have been a simple question. When have you guys ever known me to be anything but long-winded? Checking the chat room. Do you use a shop-made saw vise or manufactured when sharpening? Both. I have the Gramercy saw vise, lives over here on my bench. That's what I use for most of my saws. And then up against the wall back there, I have a 36-inch long saw vise that I've actually got a video on making it on this channel that I specifically made to sharpen my resaw blades, my 48-inch and my 36-inch long resaw blades. It also, now that I have it, I use it for all of my hand saws because my longest hand saw is 28 inches. They fit in there and I can do the entire run of teeth without having to move the thing around. Whereas this is, 14 inches, I think? Something like that. So yeah, I have a little bit of both. There was a question about squares. I left that to the end because it was off topic. What squares do I use, I think? Please, by all means, if I missed questions, feel free to pose them again if I didn't see them. So great to have saw makers in the chat room. Thanks for coming, Brian and Eric. Very cool to have you here. Florb Toolworks trades saws for cash. That's a novel idea. Okay. Yeah, what squares do I use? I have Starrett, little 4-inch square, and I've got a Starrett 12-inch square. Those are the mainstays. I've got a shop-made square that I use a lot because it's got a long 14-inch long blade. And then I've got a shop-made layout square that I use for, well, layout of rough boards and things. I think that's it. I don't think I have any other squares. I've got bevel gauges. Yeah. The Starrett square, fan-damn-tastic, super pricey. I blame Mark Spagnolo for that because he told me years ago I had to have a Starrett square. It is so much more precise than anything I actually need in my shop. In my shop in Maine, I've got a, $4 or $6 Home Depot combo square special. Works great. Works like a charm. Perfectly accurate for the work that I need. So yeah, this is one of those do as I say, not as I do things. I have a Starrett. It's awesome. And if you really like finely made tools, I highly recommend it. But man, it is so much more precise than anything I ever need. The last thing I'll say is Veritas. These saws you're seeing here, they're expensive, rightfully so. We've got 2 saw makers in the chat room right now. Saws are very expensive to make. And the level of care and attention to detail and just the bling factor that gets added to most of these saws, it's so cool, the world that we live in now, that we can have these types of saws. But boy, they're pricey. The array of saws I have here, I didn't buy that one. That one was given to me as well. The rest of them I bought. I don't even want to know the total here. There's a lot of money of saws on this bench. You're talking 8 years of saw buying at this point in order to do this. So there's got to be a solution, right? There's got to be a more run-of-the-mill. And Lie-Nielsen makes a more affordable saw than the boutique ones. It's not that much more affordable. It's still expensive. But again, that's one of the reasons they call it a middle-of-the-road saw. It is a fantastic saw. It's not going to have the fit and finish that you're going to have with some of the boutique makers. It's not going to have the added bling factor. You know, I mean, this has freaking mother of pearl medallions on it. Come on. You know, the engraving on the back is just awesome. It's got pinstriping on the spine. It's so cool. Quilted sapele handle, supplied by Jacobs and McIlvaine Lumber Company, I might add. You know, that's the coolness factor. Lee Nielsen's not going to have that. Now, they've got quilted maple handles. It's pretty cool. Veritas entered the world and turned everybody on their head because you can buy, what, 3 saws for like $60 now? They are super affordable, super inexpensive. I don't want to say cheap because they are not cheaply made. Do they still use Bubinga for the handles? That's probably going to change if they haven't already because that's CITES listed now. But, you know, they've got that molded spine. Again, it's not a folded back. It is glued or epoxied in place. The hang angles I find are a bit weird. I feel like they tried to innovate a little too much, and the way that molded spine works, it changed the hang angle a little bit. So I have found, I've used them a lot. When I taught down at Sean Graham, you guys know his channel is worth the effort. When I taught down at his school, Sean had stocked the entire school with Veritas saws because they're super affordable. And I used them all weekend long. I've used that Veritas Dovetail saw quite a lot. I've used the Carcass saw quite a lot. Multiple times when I've been at shows, they've been there, I've used them. I've had several people loan them to me to get experience with over time. I don't personally own any. Because again, when Veritas came on the scene, I was already pretty well set with saws. So I didn't go and buy a Veritas saw. But I've used them extensively, and I've also altered the geometry a fair bit. The biggest issue I have, especially with the Veritas Dovetail saw, is a lot of people struggle with it getting it started. And starting a saw is all about unweighting the toe. And because of the weird hang angle, and because of the kind of the weirder handle, and because I think of an odd choice in tooth geometry, those saws are harder to start. So what I do is I come back and I relax the first 10 to 15 teeth. I relax the rake on there by about 10 degrees. I cant it back 10 degrees from wherever it is now. It's probably closer to 15 degrees at that point. And then I leave the rest of it alone. So it's a progressive rake saw. More rake at the first inch and less rake at the back. So it cuts more aggressively at the back, but it's easier to start at the front because it's harder to unweight that toe the way the handle is shaped and the way the hang is, that it requires a little bit of surgery. And every time I've done that for somebody, their sawing problems have gone away right away. So, you know, it's what you expect, right? You spend less money on a tool, there's probably going to be a little bit more work you may have to put into it later. That's to be perfectly expected. And honestly, relaxing the rake on that, I've done that now 6 times for 6 different people. Each time it takes 20 seconds. You know, you have to have a fair amount of comfortability and you have to have sharpened a saw before. But if you have like one of the Veritas angle jigger thingies, saw filing guides, that makes it even easier to set that rake angle precisely. It's super quick and it dramatically changes how that saw performs. The Tenon saw, it's okay out of the box. I find that it's pitched a little too light and I think it's not quite as aggressive as it should be. I think Veritas probably did some product testing and more people had trouble starting it, so they just made it easier to start. I don't want to use the words dumbed it down, but that's really what it comes down to. They made it more appealing to a wider skill level. For people just getting started with saws, they made it a heck of a lot easier to start. For me, I feel like I'm sawing through mud when I use that Tenon saw. It is so soft feeling and so slow in cutting because of the way the teeth have been altered to make it easier to start, to make it more precise for someone that doesn't know any better. Perfectly fine for an entry-level saw. It's got an entry-level price point. I just think that that's fantastic, that it's super cheap. It's a great way to get started in saws very, very quickly and knowing that they're sharp, knowing that they're set up right. But I think eventually you will upgrade. So if you embrace the idea of buy your last tool first, Veritas is not the way to go with saws. Great way to go with hand planes, not so much with saws. I just find there's been too many innovations. They jiggered with the tried and true recipe a little bit too much, and for someone that does a lot of sawing, someone that prides themselves on my sawing ability, I find their saws to be like mush. I'm not a fan. So yeah, I've had people who specifically asked, what are my thoughts on Veritas saws? Because they're so cheap. So again, buy them, but be prepared to probably buy another saw 2 years. Maybe not. Maybe you will be perfectly comfortable with it. For me, it wasn't a match. Yeah, there's my thoughts on Veritas. And I think when it comes to the vintage saw market, I'm really picky there on what I buy. I'm a lot more comfortable with restoring saws now than I was like even 5 years ago. But obviously I don't do it a lot because I've got saws that work perfectly well. I've got a really great Atkins 16-inch back saw that's 4-inch depth of plate in my shop in Maine that I restored last year. And that sucker is wonderful. There is real joy in a vintage saw. There's something very sweet about the steel they used, the shaping of the handles. There was a lot of thought that went into those, especially when you stray away from some of the Distons, which were more mass-produced, moving into Spears and Jackson. Atkins specifically, Atkins to me are actual gems. But there's a lot of work that goes into restoring them. You know, they don't have to be perfectly polished, reflective, smooth and everything. You do want to get the active rust plumes off. And you've got to know a little bit about what you're doing to sharpen a saw. But I also contest that saw sharpening is not rocket science. I learned to do it. It really didn't take that long. If you take the extra step of buying one of those filing guides, which I highly recommend, unless you file saws all the time and really develop those Ingrams, that muscle memory, that filing guide is great. Because I may sharpen my back saws once every 6 months, especially because I have a lot of back saws. So I just haven't built up that feeling. Having that guide just makes it idiot-proof for me. You set it and forget it. It's like a Ronco saw filer. That actually is a really, really great advantage. You're not going to go through that many saw files when you're first starting because you're just not doing that much saw filing. So if you like the feel of vintage tools and you can find a vintage back saw that does not have a kink in the plate, the spine is not bent, and really the handle is in good shape, although there's enough resources online now for Blackburn Toolworks comes to mind immediately. And I haven't mentioned Isaac today because I understand that Isaac is not actually producing saws at the moment. I don't know if he's coming back into it or what. I've used several of his saws at Lee Nielsen tool shows. Phenomenal saws, great saws. Do not own any because he hasn't been selling any for a while. But Isaac also has a lot of CAD drawings of vintage saw patterns available on his website. So if you find a vintage saw that has just a wonky handle that's all beat up, if it is missing either of these two horns, it will need to be replaced. These horns are so important for back saws. Not that important for hand saws, important for hand saws, but not even close to as important as they are for back saws. Taking the weight off the toe entirely relies upon that upper horn. The fit and that feeling of being able to control the saw relies upon that upper horn. It's so important. So if those are broken, you're gonna have to replace the handle. So you can find vintage patterns, and we're woodworkers, right? We can work wood into the shape we want. If you're not comfortable with that, then you need to find a vintage saw that's got the handle intact. But really, I think a lot of people obsess over or worry about vintage saws as a place to start because saw sharpening is this mystical black art thing. And, yeah, you can screw up a saw plate by doing it. But the good news is you can file it again and fix it. If you really shape the teeth and they're really ragged looking, then you go back and you do it again. And yes, you're filing away steel, you're making the saw shorter, but not so much shorter that it's going to be the end of the world. So I recommend if you want to get into saw sharpening, if you want to get into saws cheaply and you have access to some vintage saws, take the leap. File it 1 or 2 times and you will figure out that the saw sharpening part is really not that difficult and the whole world opens to you. So as far as which saw files do I recommend, I've used Grobet before, I've used Nicholson. Right now I'm using Grobet files, G-R-B-E-T. Again, I don't file saws enough that I go, oh, those saw files are much better than any others. The saw makers in the room probably have a lot more skin in the game on which ones they prefer. I know Niles Kreck at Kennebec Saws is now selling saw files, and he files a lot of saws. I can't remember exactly what brands he's using, but I know he stands behind that brand. I also bought the Veritas pack. It can be a little bit difficult. It tends to go out of stock a lot. But This is a great way to start because it comes in this great little case. The good news for me about it is they're all labeled because I sometimes get them mixed up and I can't tell which is which. Some of these are the ones that came with the Veritas files. And there was a time not so long ago when I could tell you exactly what it read, but now that I'm in my mid-40s, I'm just getting to the point where you have to start to hold it a little bit further away. Just getting to that point. This is a Grobet. Veritas may be selling Grobet files now. This is a Nicholson. So yeah, I'm kind of brand agnostic when it comes to saw files. A lot of times what I find is they can be difficult to get. A lot of the people that sell them are constantly out of stock, and that's the bigger issue. But this is a great way to start that Veritas set. You get pretty much everything you need in one purchase and a way to keep them nice and safe, and they're all labeled so that it's really easy to pick it up and say, okay, I need a 6-inch slim taper. It's right there on there. Plus it comes with a little chart that tells you exactly which saw files you use for which pitch. There's lots of places online to find that as well, but it's just kind of nice. The short dovetail saw is Bearcat Toolworks. He's just a couple below you. He's one below you in the chat room when you asked that question, Don. Right there, Bearcat Wood. That's him. He made it. Nice job, Brian. Well done. I think that's it, guys. I'm well past my allotted hour here, so if anybody has additional backsaw questions, you can always find me on Instagram. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook. Get me at renaissancewoodworker.com. Time for my plug. I have launched a Patreon campaign for this. Just kind of a way to, I'm going to keep doing the show no matter what, but if you want to show a little support, patreon.com/renaissancewoodworker. That just got started. Got some fun little, milestone things along the way, but also I've got some options to help, you guys can help me shape the show a little bit more by choosing topics and things like that. So it's all over at Patreon. I love it. Appreciate the supporters I've gotten so far. Thank you very much. Christopher Bubinga is now CITES listed, Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species, CITES. Google it. You will probably find blog posts written by yours truly at McIlvaine.com. Bubinga is an appendix to CITES listed species. If you want to know what CITES is, go to lumberupdate.com. It's my other podcast. You can find more info there. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you hanging out with me on a Wednesday evening. And next week we'll figure out what we're going to talk about. If anybody has suggestions, let me know. If you sponsor the show as a Patreon and you make a suggestion, you will probably come true. I'm not above bribery. Good night, everybody.